Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, watching the Pacific dawn break across the horizon on June 4, 1942. The salty wind carried with it what he believed would be the scent of victory, but unbeknownst to him, it bore the seeds of Japan's greatest naval disaster. The carefully orchestrated plan to lure the American fleet into a decisive battle at Midway Atoll was already unraveling, even as his pilots prepared for their first strike. The Japanese strategy, conceived by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself, seemed flawless on paper. The combined fleet would approach Midway in multiple groups, creating a complex web of deception designed to scatter American forces. Nagumo's first air fleet, consisting of 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would strike the island installations while Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo's invasion force approached from the southwest. Meanwhile, Yamamoto's main battle fleet would remain in reserve, ready to annihilate any American naval forces that dared to respond. But the foundation of this elaborate plan rested on a critical assumption that proved fatally flawed. The Americans didn't know they were coming. In the intelligence rooms of Pearl Harbor, however, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of codebreakers had been working around the clock, deciphering Japanese naval communications through their breakthrough in cracking the JN-25 code. According to declassified naval intelligence documents from the National Archives, the Americans had intercepted and decoded enough Japanese messages to understand not only the timing of the attack, but also its primary objective and force composition. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, had received detailed intelligence reports by late May. The Japanese were planning something massive, and all signs pointed to Midway as the target. Unlike the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier, this time the Americans would be ready. Nimitz made the bold decision to commit virtually his entire available fleet to defend the tiny atoll, despite having only 3 operational aircraft carriers against Japan's 4. As Nagumo's task force steamed toward Midway through the pre-dawn darkness, they maintained strict radio silence, believing their approach remained undetected. The admiral reviewed his orders one final time. Neutralize Midway's air defenses with a powerful first strike, then prepare for the arrival of American naval forces, which intelligence suggested wouldn't appear for several days. His pilots had been briefed on their targets: the airfield, fuel storage facilities, and defensive installations that needed to be destroyed before the invasion force could safely land. What Nagumo couldn't know was that 3 American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, were already positioned northeast of Midway, having departed Pearl Harbor days earlier based on Rochefort's intelligence windfall. Task Force 16, under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, and Task Force 17, commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, had taken position in what would become known as Point Luck, waiting for the Japanese to walk into their trap. The irony was profound. While the Japanese believed they were setting an ambush, they were actually sailing into one. Their strategy, built on the assumption of surprise and superior force concentration, was compromised before the first aircraft had even been spotted by American radar operators on Midway. The careful choreography of Yamamoto's plan required precise timing and coordination between multiple fleet elements, but this complexity would become a liability when faced with an enemy who knew their every move. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the flight decks of both fleets, the stage was set for a battle that would reshape the Pacific War. The Japanese strategy was already falling apart, even though no bombs had yet fallen and no torpedoes had been launched. The advantage of surprise, upon which everything depended, had been lost in the electronic corridors of American code-breaking facilities thousands of miles away. In the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor, the fluorescent lights had been burning continuously for 72 hours. Commander Joseph Rochefort, head of Station Hypo, rubbed his tired eyes as he reviewed another batch of intercepted Japanese naval communications. His team of cryptanalysts, working in shifts around the clock, had achieved what many thought impossible. They had penetrated the Japanese Navy's most secret operational code. The breakthrough had come through painstaking analysis of thousands of intercepted radio messages over months of careful work. By late May 1942, Rochefort's team had identified that the Japanese were planning a major operation against target AF. Through an ingenious deception, having Midway broadcast a false message about water problems in plain English, they had confirmed that AF was indeed Midway Atoll. This intelligence coup would prove more decisive than any weapon in the coming battle. Admiral Nimitz had initially faced skepticism from Washington about the reliability of this intelligence. Some officers in the Navy Department believed the Japanese target might be the West Coast or even Pearl Harbor itself, but Nimitz trusted Rochefort's assessment completely. Acting on this intelligence, he made decisions that would have seemed reckless without the advantage of foreknowledge. He recalled Task Force 16 from the South Pacific and prepared to commit his entire available fleet to defend what appeared to be a small, strategically insignificant atoll. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese flagship Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto remained confident in his plan's secrecy. The operation, designated MI, had been planned with elaborate security measures. Communications were kept to a minimum, and when messages were transmitted, they were encoded using the Navy's most secure cipher systems. Yamamoto believed that even if the Americans detected some preparation activity, they would be unable to determine the specific target or timing of the attack. The Japanese Naval Intelligence Services had also been active, but their efforts had yielded incomplete and often inaccurate information. They estimated American carrier strength in the Pacific at only 2 operational vessels, believing that Yorktown had been sunk or severely damaged during the recent Battle of the Coral Sea. In reality, the carrier had been repaired at Pearl Harbor in a remarkable 72-hour effort that saw hundreds of shipyard workers laboring around the clock to make her battle-ready. This intelligence failure on the Japanese side was compounded by their rigid adherence to the operational schedule. The attack on Midway had been timed to coincide with the first anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attack, creating symbolic importance that made postponement difficult even if new intelligence suggested American awareness of the plan. The Japanese High Command had invested too much prestige in the operation to consider significant modifications based on incomplete intelligence indicators. As dawn approached on June 4th, the disparity in intelligence preparation became starkly apparent. American pilots had been briefed not only on the expected timing of the Japanese approach, but also on the likely composition and positioning of enemy forces. Radar operators on Midway had been alerted to watch for incoming aircraft from the northwest, and defensive preparations had been completed days in advance. The Japanese, conversely, were operating under assumptions that had already been invalidated. Their pilots prepared for what they believed would be a surprise attack against unprepared defenses, followed by several days of maneuvering before American naval forces could arrive from Pearl Harbor or the West Coast. The gap between perception and reality had grown to dangerous proportions. According to historical analysis published by the Naval Institute Press, this intelligence asymmetry represented perhaps the most complete reversal of strategic surprise in naval warfare history. The hunters had become the hunted, but remained unaware of their changed circumstances. Every assumption underlying Japanese tactical planning was wrong, from the strength of American forces to their positioning and state of readiness. As the Japanese carriers began launching their first strike against Midway, they were already sailing into a carefully prepared trap. The American advantage was not in superior numbers or equipment. Indeed, many Japanese aircraft and pilots were superior to their American counterparts, but in complete foreknowledge of enemy intentions and capabilities. The battle would be won or lost not by the bombs that were about to fall, but by the intelligence war that had already been decided in favor of the Americans. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron adjusted his headset as he led Torpedo Squadron 8 toward the Japanese fleet, his 15 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers flying low over the Pacific swells. It was 10:20 in the morning of June 4th, 1942, and he was about to lead his men into what military historians would later call one of the most courageous and tragic attacks in naval aviation history. Unknown to Waldron, his sacrifice would play a crucial role in exposing the fundamental flaws in Japanese fleet air defense procedures. Aboard the carrier Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced a dilemma that perfectly illustrated how Japanese strategy was crumbling from within. His first strike against Midway had achieved tactical success, damaging facilities on the island, but the strike commander, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, had radioed back a request that would prove fatal. "There is need for a second attack wave." The message, received at 7:05, forced Nagumo to make a decision that would cascade through the entire Japanese battle plan. The original strategy called for keeping half of his aircraft armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, ready to attack any American naval forces that might appear. But Tomonaga's assessment suggested that Midway's defenses remained dangerous to the incoming invasion force. Nagumo ordered the fatal rearming. Torpedo bombers and dive bombers were to be refitted with land attack ordnance for a second strike against the island. What Nagumo couldn't know was that this decision would leave his fleet vulnerable at precisely the moment when American dive bombers would appear overhead. The rearming process was complex and time-consuming, requiring aircraft to be moved between hangar decks and flight decks while ordnance crews swapped weapons and adjusted fusing systems. Bombs and torpedoes meant for ship killing were stacked temporarily on hangar decks, creating what would become massive secondary explosions. The Japanese communication system, which had served them well in previous engagements, began to break down under the stress of simultaneous operations. Radio discipline, essential for coordinating complex fleet movements, deteriorated as multiple task groups attempted to maintain contact while observing radio silence protocols. Reconnaissance aircraft reported conflicting information about American ship positions, creating confusion about the size and composition of enemy forces. At 11:20, just as the rearming operation was nearing completion, a delayed reconnaissance report finally reached Nagumo with devastating news. American naval forces, including what appeared to be aircraft carriers, were positioned northeast of Midway. The message, from a scout plane launched hours earlier, had been delayed by communication failures and atmospheric interference. Nagumo immediately ordered another rearming back to anti-ship weapons, but the damage was already done. The complexity of coordinating 4 aircraft carriers, each with its own air group and maintenance schedule, had created a logistical nightmare. Aboard Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, similar rearming operations were underway, with hundreds of aviation ordnance personnel working frantically to reconfigure aircraft weapons loads. The process that had begun as routine preparation had become a race against time, with each carrier operating on a slightly different schedule based on when they had received and interpreted Nagumo's orders. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's Air Group 6, had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over 2 hours when he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward. His decision to follow that ship would prove to be one of the most consequential navigational choices in military history. According to official Navy after-action reports housed in the National Archives, McCluskey's 37 dive bombers were running low on fuel and would soon have to turn back when this stroke of fortune led them directly to Nagumo's carriers. The timing was perfect from the American perspective and catastrophic for the Japanese. At precisely 10:22, as Nagumo's carriers were most vulnerable, their decks crowded with fully fueled and armed aircraft preparing for takeoff, McCluskey's dive bombers rolled into their attacks. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, having been drawn down to low altitude by the torpedo bomber attacks, was out of position to interfere with the diving Dauntless aircraft. What followed in the next few minutes would validate every prediction made by American intelligence analysts. The Japanese strategy, dependent on maintaining the initiative and controlling the timing of engagements, collapsed as multiple catastrophic explosions ripped through 3 of their 4 fleet carriers. The careful choreography of Yamamoto's plan, which required precise coordination between scattered fleet elements, dissolved into chaos as the core of Japanese naval aviation was destroyed in a matter of minutes. The irony was complete. The same communication systems and tactical flexibility that had made the Japanese Navy supreme in previous battles had become the instruments of their defeat. Orders were misunderstood, timing was lost, and the initiative passed permanently to American forces who had prepared for exactly this moment. The dance of miscommunication that had begun with delayed reconnaissance reports had ended with the destruction of Japan's most experienced carrier air groups. The dive bomber's engine screamed as Lieutenant Richard Best pushed his Douglas SBD Dauntless into a near-vertical dive toward the Japanese carrier Akagi. It was exactly 10:26 on the morning of June 4, 1942, and Best was leading the attack that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Pacific War. Below him, the massive flight deck of Admiral Nagumo's flagship presented a target rich with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance, a floating ammunition depot waiting to explode. From his position on Akagi's bridge, Admiral Nagumo watched in horrified fascination as American dive bombers materialized out of the high clouds like avenging angels. The timing was impossibly bad. His carriers were at their most vulnerable moment, their decks crowded with fully fueled aircraft preparing for launch against the American fleet. The rearming operation that had consumed the morning hours had left bombs and torpedoes scattered across hangar decks, while aviation gasoline lines remained pressurized throughout the ships. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, consisting of Zero fighters that had dominated Pacific skies for months, was caught completely out of position. They had been drawn down to wave-top level by the courageous but doomed torpedo bomber attacks of Torpedo Squadron 8 and other American units. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron and his men had paid with their lives. Only one crew member from his entire squadron would survive, but their sacrifice had cleared the sky for the dive bombers now screaming down from 20,000 feet. Lieutenant Best released his 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb at precisely the right moment, watching as it arced toward Akagi's flight deck. The explosion, when it came, was far more devastating than anyone had anticipated. The bomb penetrated the wooden flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar, where it ignited aviation gasoline vapors and triggered a chain reaction among the stored ordnance. Within minutes, uncontrollable fires were raging through the ship that had served as the flagship for the attack on Pearl Harbor. Simultaneously, other dive bomber sections were attacking the carriers Kaga and Soryu with equally devastating results. The Japanese had distributed their carrier force to maximize striking power and provide mutual support, but this dispersion now worked against them. Each carrier was experiencing its own catastrophe, with damage control parties overwhelmed by multiple fires and explosions. The careful training and equipment that had made Japanese carriers the most effective in the world proved inadequate against the fury of internal explosions. Captain Taijiro Aoki, commanding Akagi, found himself faced with an impossible situation. His ship was being consumed by fires that threatened to reach the main magazine spaces, where a single explosion would vaporize the entire vessel. The flight deck, twisted and buckled by repeated explosions, could no longer launch or recover aircraft. Most critically, the sophisticated communication systems that linked his ship to the rest of the fleet had been destroyed in the first few minutes of the attack. The psychological impact on Japanese personnel was perhaps as devastating as the physical damage. These were the same ships and many of the same men who had struck Pearl Harbor with impunity just 6 months earlier. They had come to regard American naval aviation as inferior in training, equipment, and fighting spirit. The sudden reversal of fortune, achieved in less than 5 minutes of combat, shattered assumptions that had guided Japanese naval strategy since the beginning of the war. According to declassified battle damage reports compiled by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, the American attack achieved complete tactical surprise despite being detected by Japanese radar systems. The failure was not in detection, but in response. Japanese fighter direction systems were overwhelmed by the complexity of defending against simultaneous attacks from multiple directions and altitudes. The rigid tactical doctrines that had served them well in previous engagements proved inadequate when faced with coordinated multi-axis assaults. Admiral Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from the carrier Enterprise, received the first reports of successful attacks at 10:35. The radio messages from his returning pilots were almost euphoric in tone. They had found the Japanese carriers at exactly the moment of maximum vulnerability and had achieved devastating hits. But Spruance, a careful and methodical commander, knew that the battle was far from over. The Japanese still had one operational carrier, and their surface fleet remained a formidable threat. The strategic implications were already becoming clear to both sides. Japan's carefully husbanded force of experienced naval aviators, irreplaceable men who had trained for years before the war, were being consumed in the fires now raging through 3 fleet carriers. The United States, with its massive industrial capacity and training programs, could replace lost aircraft and even ships, but Japan's pilot training pipeline could never produce enough experienced air crews to maintain their early war superiority. As smoke columns rose thousands of feet into the Pacific sky, marking the funeral pyres of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the fundamental assumptions underlying Japanese naval strategy lay in ruins alongside the twisted steel of their flight decks. The moment of truth had arrived, and it revealed that American intelligence preparation, tactical coordination, and sheer determination had overcome what had seemed like insurmountable Japanese advantages in experience and equipment. Captain Tomeo Kaku stood on the bridge of the carrier Hiryu, the sole surviving Japanese flat-top in Admiral Nagumo's once mighty First Air Fleet. The towering columns of black smoke rising from his 3 sister ships painted a grim picture against the afternoon sky of June 4, 1942. As the senior aviator among the Japanese carrier commanders, Kaku understood better than most what these losses meant, not just for this battle, but for Japan's entire naval war strategy. The original Japanese plan had called for overwhelming American forces through superior concentration and timing. Now, with 3/4 of his striking force destroyed and his own ship isolated, Kaku faced the terrible mathematics of naval warfare. He could launch perhaps 30 aircraft against an American force that likely included multiple carriers with full air groups. Yet honor and duty demanded that he continue fighting, even in what increasingly appeared to be a hopeless situation. At 14:05, Kaku launched his strike against the American fleet, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, with 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters. These were among Japan's most experienced naval aviators, men who had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack and subsequent campaigns throughout the Pacific. Their skill and determination would be tested against American defenders who had gained confidence from their morning successes and were now operating with the tactical initiative. The American carriers, meanwhile, were dealing with their own complex challenges. The hastily repaired Yorktown had suffered damage during the morning's operations, and her flight deck crews were working frantically to maintain operational capability. Admiral Fletcher, commanding Task Force 17 from Yorktown's bridge, found himself coordinating defensive operations while simultaneously preparing counterstrikes against the remaining Japanese forces. The radar operators aboard the American ships detected Kobayashi's incoming strike at a range of over 60 miles, providing precious time to launch fighters and prepare defensive measures. This early warning capability, still relatively new in naval warfare, represented another technological advantage that the Americans had developed while Japanese strategy remained focused on offensive operations. The ability to track incoming aircraft and coordinate defensive responses would prove crucial in the afternoon's engagements. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, leading Fighting Squadron 3 from Yorktown, had developed new aerial tactics specifically designed to counter the superior maneuverability of Japanese Zero fighters. His thatch-weave formation allowed American Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters to support each other against more agile opponents, using teamwork and radio communication to overcome individual aircraft limitations. These tactics would receive their first major test during the defense against Kobayashi's attack. The Japanese strike achieved partial success, scoring several hits on Yorktown and forcing her to reduce speed. But the cost was enormous. Most of Kobayashi's aircraft were shot down by American fighters or anti-aircraft fire. The experienced Japanese pilots, irreplaceable products of years of intensive training, were being consumed at an unsustainable rate. According to post-war analysis by Japanese naval historians, the loss of these veteran air crews would prove more strategically significant than even the destruction of the carriers themselves. Admiral Spruance, now the senior American commander on scene following damage to Yorktown, made the crucial decision to launch an immediate counterstrike against Hiryu. His air operations officer, Commander Miles Browning, coordinated a force of 24 dive bombers from Enterprise, supported by fighters and escort aircraft. The American doctrine emphasized rapid follow-up attacks to prevent enemy recovery, a principle that would prove decisive in preventing any Japanese comeback. As the afternoon sun climbed toward its zenith, the fundamental shift in Pacific naval power became undeniable. The Japanese had begun the battle with 4 large fleet carriers and over 200 experienced naval aviators. Now they were reduced to a single damaged carrier with a rapidly diminishing air group, while the Americans retained 2 operational carriers with largely intact air groups and defensive capabilities. The strategic implications extended far beyond this single engagement. Japan's pre-war strategy had been based on achieving decisive victories in limited campaigns, using superior training and equipment to overcome American industrial advantages. The Battle of Midway was revealing the fundamental flaw in this approach. Even victories came at costs that Japan could not sustain indefinitely, while American losses could be replaced and often improved upon. Captain Kaku, watching his last aircraft disappear into the Pacific haze on what he knew would likely be their final mission, understood that Japanese naval aviation had suffered a wound from which it might never recover. The careful accumulation of experience and expertise that had taken years to develop was being destroyed in a single day's combat. The turning tide was not just tactical but strategic. The foundation of Japanese naval supremacy was dissolving beneath the waves of the Pacific, even as the battle continued to rage across hundreds of square miles of ocean. The sun that had risen on Japanese confidence now illuminated the wreckage of their most cherished strategic assumptions, leaving only duty and honor to sustain men who were beginning to glimpse the true cost of their empire's ambitions. Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson banked his bullet-riddled SBD Dauntless away from the burning Japanese carrier Hiryu, watching secondary explosions ripple along her flight deck as aviation gasoline fires consumed the last operational carrier in Admiral Nagumo's fleet. It was 17:05 on June 4, 1942, and Dickinson had just participated in the attack that would seal Japan's fate in the Pacific War. The dive bomber's engine coughed irregularly, damaged by anti-aircraft fire, but it carried him steadily back toward Enterprise and safety. Below him, Captain Tomeo Kaku surveyed the devastation that had befallen his command. Hiryu's flight deck was a twisted mass of steel and flame, her hangar spaces filled with smoke and the screams of wounded men. The carrier that had successfully launched 2 strikes against American forces was now following her sister ships toward the bottom of the Pacific. Kaku's decision was inevitable. He would go down with his ship, accepting responsibility for the catastrophe that had befallen the First Air Fleet. The mathematics of naval warfare had rendered their verdict with brutal clarity. Japan had committed 4 of its finest aircraft carriers to the Midway operation, along with their most experienced pilots and maintenance crews. In a single day of combat, They had lost all 4 carriers, approximately 250 aircraft, and over 3,000 personnel, including many irreplaceable aviation specialists. The American losses, while significant, were far less crippling. 1 carrier damaged and eventually sunk, approximately 150 aircraft lost, and roughly 300 casualties. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard his flagship Yamato hundreds of miles to the west, received the catastrophic reports with growing horror. His carefully crafted plan to destroy the American Pacific Fleet had instead resulted in the destruction of Japan's own carrier strike force. The complex operation, involving multiple task groups and precise timing, had collapsed when its fundamental assumption, achieving surprise, proved false. Now he faced the terrible decision of whether to commit his battleship force in a desperate attempt to salvage something from the disaster. The intelligence failure that had doomed Japanese strategy was now compounded by communication breakdowns throughout the scattered fleet. Yamamoto's various task groups had been operating under radio silence, making coordination difficult even under ideal circumstances. Now, with the primary striking force destroyed and American submarines reported in the area, the carefully orchestrated dance of fleet movements had devolved into chaos. Orders were delayed, positions were uncertain, and morale was plummeting throughout the combined fleet. Captain Richard Fleming, piloting a Marine Corps dive bomber from Midway itself, exemplified the determination that had characterized American resistance throughout the battle. Despite mechanical problems with his aircraft, Fleming pressed home his attack against the Japanese heavy cruiser Mikuma, sacrificing his life in a direct hit that would contribute to that ship's eventual sinking. His posthumous Medal of Honor would represent the spirit that had transformed an apparent Japanese victory into devastating defeat. The strategic reversal was complete and irreversible. Japanese naval doctrine had emphasized achieving decisive victories through superior concentration of force and better trained personnel. At Midway, they had indeed concentrated their finest assets and watched them disappear beneath Pacific waves in the span of a few hours. The United States, with its massive industrial capacity and growing military production, could replace lost ships and aircraft relatively quickly. Japan, already straining its limited resources, would never recover from losses of this magnitude. According to post-war interviews with surviving Japanese officers conducted by American naval intelligence, the psychological impact of the defeat was as significant as the material losses. The officers and men who had carried out the Pearl Harbor attack with such devastating success now found themselves struggling to understand how American forces had achieved such complete tactical and strategic surprise. The myth of Japanese naval invincibility, carefully cultivated through early war victories, lay shattered alongside the burning hulks of their carriers. Admiral Nimitz, receiving reports at his Pearl Harbor headquarters, recognized immediately that a fundamental shift had occurred in Pacific naval warfare. The Japanese advantage in experience and equipment had been neutralized by superior intelligence and better tactical coordination. More importantly, American naval aviation had proven itself capable of achieving decisive results when properly prepared and led. The defensive phase of the Pacific War was ending. Soon, American forces would begin their own offensive operations. As darkness fell over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, the last Japanese aircraft struggled back toward bases that no longer existed. Pilots who had been confident of victory that morning now found themselves floating in life rafts or swimming in oil-stained waters, wondering how their superior training and equipment had failed them so completely. The answer lay not in any single tactical error, but in the cumulative effect of strategic assumptions that had proven fatally wrong.